And so that takes us to our last reader, which is,
Who's that?
yeah, Miss Felicia Minor.
Okay, so I picked this book because I if you watch our show, I talked about the color blue, and that being a thing that is pressed on the males of
Mhm,
whatever.
mhm,
And so I think that's what drew me to this book. But I also follow George M. Johnson on Twitter, which led me to, I go down these weird online rabbit holes and fall into things. But I have the book on Kindle, but I just ordered the hardback so I could or the hardcover so I could see. I like to
mhm.
feel the book.
Mm, me
So
too.
I'm just gonna read the introduction because that kind of gives you a clue of what the rest of the book is like. But the book has pockets of surprises and things that
Mhm.
people should definitely read for themselves. So
Cool. All right. I'm excited.
the introduction reads Black Queer Here. The story of how I entered the world was a foreshadowing. When my aunt first saw my head full of jet black curly hair crown from my mother's womb, she ran into the hospital's hallway where my family waited. It's a girl! It's a girl! She yelled, to my grandmother's excitement and to my father's slight disappointment. But by the time my aunt got back to the delivery room and I was fully born, she realized her quick assumption would soon need correcting. She ran back out to the family and said, actually, it's a boy. The it's a girl, no, it's a boy mix up is funny on paper, but not quite so hilarious in real life, especially when the star of that story struggles with their identity. Gender is one of the biggest projections placed onto children at birth, despite families having no idea how the baby will truly turn out. In our society, a person's sex is based on their genitalia. That decision is then used to assume a person's gender as boy or girl, rather than a spectrum of identities that the child should be determining themselves. Nowadays, we're assigning gender even before birth. Yes, we have become socially conditioned to participate in the gendering of children at the earliest possible moment. Whenever a sonogram can identify its genitalia, gender reveal parties have become a trendy way to celebrate the child's fate, steering them down a life of masculine or feminine ideals before ever meeting them. It's as if the more visible LGBTQIAP plus people become, the harder the heterosexual community attempts to apply new norms. I think the majority fear becoming the minority. And so and so they will do anything and everything to protect their power. I often wonder what this world would look like if people were simply told you're having a baby with a penis or a vagina or other genitalia. Look up intersex if you're confused about other. What if parents were also given instructions to nurture their baby by paying attention to what the child naturally gravitates toward and simply feed those interests? Hmm. What if parents let their child explore their own gender instead of pushing them down one of those two roads society tells us exist? When our gender is assigned at birth, we are also assigned responsibilities to grow and to maneuver through the life based on the simple checking of those boxes: male, female, black, white, straight, gay, kids, Mm. Kids don't fit the perfect boxes often. Kids who don't fit the perfect boxes are often left asking themselves, am I a girl? Am I a boy? Am I both? Am I neither? As a child, I struggled mightily with these questions, and that struggle continued to show up in various ways throughout my life. Now, as an adult, I have a much better grasp on sexuality, gender, and the way society pressures us to conform to what has been the norm. I understand how this sense of normality doesn't hold a space for those of us who don't fit the aesthetic of what girls or boys should be or how a man or woman should perform. Unfortunately, we are still struggling to move the conversation past an assumed identity at birth and LGBTQIAP plus people are not just fighting for the right to self-identify and be accepted in society that is predominantly composed of two genders. which which would be the bare minimum of acceptance. We are also fighting to survive physical acts of violence. Many of us are not even surviving that. The spectrum of our traumas can be as broad as our identities. I started writing this book with the intention that every chapter would end with solutions for all the uncomfortable and confusing circumstances I experienced as a gay Black child in America. I quickly learned this book would be about so much more about the overlap of my identities and the importance of sharing how those intersections create my privilege and my oppression. Many of us carry burdens from the traumas of our past, and they manifest into our adulthood. We all go through stages of accepting or struggling with our various identities, gay, straight, or non identifying. And race and various other factors play a role in how we navigate them. Many of us are always in the state of working through something, always in the state of becoming a more aware version of self. This book is an exploration of two of my identities, Black and queer, and how I became aware of their intersections within myself and in society. How I've learned that neither of these identities can be contained in a simple box that I enter the room as both of them, despite the spaces and environments I must navigate. In the white community, I'm seen as a Black man first, but that doesn't negate the queer identity that will still face discrimination. In the Black community, where I more often find myself, it is not the Black male identity that gets questioned immediately. It's the intersection with queerness that is used to reduce my Blackness and the overall image of Black men. Because this is a memoir, I'm sharing some of my personal memories with you. These memories are specific to my experience as a kid, teen, and young adult, but they also underline some of the universal experiences of Black and or queer people. My struggles are that of Black men and queer men and people who exist at the intersection of both identities. That's where the manifesto part comes in. I believe that the dominant society establishes an idea of what is normal. Normal is simply to suppress differences, which means that any of us fall outside of their, if any of us, sorry, which means that any of us who fall out of their normal means that any of us who fall outside their normal will eventually be oppressed. In each chapter of this book, I'll tell you memories of my experiences growing up and what I think they mean in a larger context living as a Black queer person. I grew up hearing the N word, which was a term of endearment in my home. It becomes a term it becomes a term of endearment in many Black families. By the time I was in middle school, I was using the word regularly with friends. It was the thing to do as a 13-year-old. That is, to curse and use the N word. We were all doing it. It was how we greeted one another, how we clowned one another. We had different tones and inflections that, excuse me, that could tell you the way the word was being used, but never with the ER at the end. We knew saying the word with the hard ER meant something different. By high school, I stopped using it. Surrounded by whiteness, I wasn't going to dare let my classmates get comfortable using that word with or around me. Anytime a white student even tried to utter it, I checked them. White kids love to test Black kids on things like that. Certain Black kids were fighting so hard to fit in, they would let white kids steal that part of our culture just so they would pretend just so they could pretend they were accepted in white society. By college, I was back in a predominantly Black school, using using the N-word again with my new friends. It was like middle school, except as an adult, I knew I could use it. No one could say anything to me. Truth be told, most professors hated that we used the word. There were they were of the opinion that the word had too much hatred in it for us to ever be able to take back full ownership in in any variation. The N word, the N word was the last word heard by many of my ancestors when they were beaten and shackled, forced into enslavement in a new land. It was the last word heard by my people when they were lynched as a spectacle for white people. Strange fruit hanging from the the poplar trees, as the great Nina Simone would sing. So, for many of my professors who grew up during Jim Crow, experiencing legalized segregation, there was no reason to be proud of that word. It was during those years in college and right after college that the NAACP and the National Action Network decided that it was time for the Black community to bury the N word. There was this belief that if we stopped using it, the word itself would lose its power. This brought out arguments on both sides. People for and against this action to destroy a word that is so tied to the most painful parts of history in America. I began to shift to the side that thought it was best to bury it. At the time, I was learning how to be a respectable Negro with the good grades and a college degree, attempting to fit into white society, wherein I felt I deserved to be treated as an equal. It was important to me that I didn't use the word because I felt it made us less than. I felt that our using that word was a bad thing because white people cringed when we said it, because certain Black people cringed when we said it. To me, it just didn't make sense to keep using it, especially because it remained controversial. I did I did what I always did with most things. I did it. I didn't want to deal with it. Buried it. I wasn't just trying to bury the N word though. In burying the N word, I was also burying my queerness. If I couldn't see parts of my own blackness as respectable, there was no way I was ready to see my queerness as respectable either. But now I know that queerness is part of blackness and that there is no blackness without queer people. Then in early 2012, Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, and my entire perspective shifted on being a black person in this society. I saw that the new age civil rights movement was being led by people who look like me, people who were fighting for me and other Black children. It was during this time that my unlearning process really began. My eyes were opened by seeing the shooting of Black people at the hands of police, seeing the killing of Black children like Tamar Rice at the hands of police, seeing that it didn't matter whether you were an affluent Black or a poor Black, a child or an adult in the society, in the eyes of society, I was still an N word. And my love for my Blackness meant that I had every right to fight for my people and every right to take back ownership of the word. So I started using the N word again. I understand that my Blackness is self-defined, and that using the use of the N word use the not use the N word is my choice. But it shouldn't be based on the comfort of those who constantly seek to invalidate me. I understand now that there is no such thing as a respectable Negro in the eyes of society, nor was I ever made to be one. Black. My second identity, queer, is a journey that I will that I will be on until the day I die. And I honestly believe that. Every day I learn something about myself. I get to sit and look back at all the times my queerness displayed itself, both in ways known to me and unknown to me. As a child, I always knew I was different. I didn't know that what that meant at the time, but I now know it was okay to be that different kid. That being different didn't mean something was wrong with me, but that something was wrong with my cultural environment, which forced me to live my life as something I wasn't. The fact that I couldn't see my full self in Black heroes or the history books was more about the changing of history and the spare white guilt that it ever was about me knowing the whole truth. I learned that kids who saw me as different didn't have an issue until society taught them to see my differences as a threat. Those differences, like being effeminate and sassy, were constantly under attack my entire childhood from kids who didn't even know why I needed to be shamed for those differences. It wasn't them shaming me as much as it was those raising them who taught them to shame me for those qualities. Most kids aren't inherently mean. Their parents, however, can make them mean. By the time I reached middle school and high school, suppression was my only option. I have become even more of a minority in the population, and I had to deal with the intersection of Blackness and queerness and the double oppression that generates for the first time ever. Fighting for Blackness in a white space came naturally to me, though, and I did it every chance I got. Fighting for my queerness, however, never seemed to be a viable or safe option. I lived in that isolation for all those years in high school. I only saw snippets of queer representation in small television roles. They were rarely played by people who looked like me, but it was never to the extent that I ever gained the confidence to be that person. Thankfully, college opened my eyes to true reflections of myself in literature, in art, in class beside me. Not not early on, but right on time. I realized that the things I had always been running from had never left my side. That that the things I had been chasing were all a myth to turn me into someone I didn't want to be. In college, I took a risk and did something that was so far so far from being queer that it should have put me deeper in the closet. I joined a fraternity. I was trying to preserve an image of masculinity for myself, something that Black fraternities have run on for years. However, in finding that frat, I found myself. I found brothers with a common experience chasing the same thing. And instead of the universe giving us what we thought we wanted, it gave us what we actually needed. It gave us unconditional love and brotherhood, and from a shared queer experience. It gave me brothers who could see my humanity outside of my queerness. It gave me the confidence to define my blackness and my queerness and my manhood and my masculinity or lack thereof. I got to live in my totality and for the first time ever exist as both black and queer in the same space and be loved for it, not shamed. Queer. I think that's as far as I'll go. And then you guys can get the book. Because it goes on for a while.